Have you ever been alone at home and felt that strange sensation, as if you were being watched? In today's video, we're going to explore 7 chilling horror stories involving moments when people were alone at home, or at least thought they were alone. And the scariest thing, all of these stories are based on real accounts. Get ready to feel the chills, and of course, don't forget to turn off the lights to get into the mood. Oh, and before we start, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming videos full of mystery and suspense. Shall we? 1. The voice in the basement. Ethan was alone in his house, an old building located in Edinburgh, Scotland. It was a cold winter's night, and the wind was whistling through the gaps in the windows. He was on the sofa, reading a book, when he heard it for the first time, a low, drawn-out voice calling his name. Ethan. The sound seemed to come from the basement. At first, he thought it was his imagination or the wind playing with the sounds. However, the voice repeated itself, clearer this time. His heart racing, Ethan decided to investigate. He took a flashlight and went down the stairs that led to the basement. The wood creaked under his feet, and the air became colder with each step. The basement was damp and dark, with stone walls that looked centuries old. In the far corner, there was an antique cabinet made of solid wood, with intricate carvings that resembled human and animal figures. Ethan had never seen this piece of furniture before and wondered how it had ended up there. As he approached the cabinet, the voice became louder and more insistent. It was as if something was trapped inside. He hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity was greater than his fear. He slowly opened the cupboard doors. To his surprise, there was nothing inside but dust and cobwebs. As he tried to turn around to leave the basement, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Ethan ran to them and tried to open them, but they were locked. It was then that he realized he was no longer alone. An icy presence took over the room. The flashlight lights began to flicker until they went out completely. In the dark, he felt something touch his shoulder. Turning quickly, he saw a hazy figure emerge from the open cupboard. The figure was tall and indistinct, but its eyes glowed an intense red. It began to speak in a language Ethan didn't recognize, but its intent was clear. It had awakened something that should have remained dormant. Desperate, Ethan began banging on the basement doors and shouting for help. Outside the house, neighbors reported hearing muffled screams that night, but no one had the courage to investigate until dawn. When they finally managed to open the basement doors the next morning, Ethan wasn't there. All they found was the old cupboard with its doors ajar and scratch marks on the floor around it. The house was abandoned soon after and gained fame in the region as being cursed. Some locals say that it is still possible to hear Ethan's voice calling for help on the quietest nights. This story has remained an unsolved mystery in Edinburgh, fueling urban legends about the cursed cupboard and the unknown forces that inhabit places forgotten by time. 2. The open window. Emily was alone in her house in New Orleans, a city known for its intense storms and haunted histories. It was a night of torrential rain, and the thunder echoed like drums in the sky. She had retired early, closing all the windows to prevent the wind and water from invading the house. But in the middle of the night, something woke her up. A strange noise was coming from upstairs. It was a subtle sound, like the creak of a window being opened. Emily sat up in bed, trying to convince herself that it was just the wind. However, the feeling that something was wrong persisted. Gathering her courage, she climbed the stairs with careful steps. When she reached the master bedroom, she found the window open. The rain was pouring in, wetting the wooden floor. Emily was sure she had locked all the windows before going to sleep. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she reached up to close it. As she gripped the sides of the window to push it against the wind, something caught her eye in the glass. A reflection. Her heart raced. There was someone behind her. Turning quickly, she saw a tall, indistinct figure standing in the dimness of the room. It was impossible to make out his face, but the outlines were clear. A man with a wide-brimmed hat and a rain-soaked overcoat. He didn't move or say anything. Emily instinctively backed up against the wall. She tried to scream, but her voice seemed stuck in her throat. When she blinked, the figure had disappeared. Without hesitation, she ran downstairs and locked herself in the living room. She grabbed her cell phone to call the police, but the signal was weak due to the storm. While she was trying to send a text message to a close friend, she heard slow footsteps coming down the stairs. The footsteps stopped in the corridor, just behind the door of the room where she was hiding. Emily held her breath, trying not to make a sound. The silence was almost unbearable until a new sound came. 3 firm knocks on the door. She didn't answer or move. The knocks were repeated, this time louder. Then, without warning, the door slowly opened with a frightening creak. Emily screamed and ran out the back door into the cold night rain. When she looked back, she saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching her without making any move to follow. The police arrived around half an hour later, but found no signs of a break-in or any intruder inside the house. However, the officers did notice something peculiar. Wet marks on the floor of the master bedroom that looked like human footprints going to the window and disappearing there. Over the next few days, Emily researched the history of the house and discovered that it had belonged to a mysterious man at the beginning of the 20th century, known for disappearing during a storm similar to that night. Since then, reports of strange apparitions had been associated with the property. Emily never returned to the house and decided to move to another state. But to this day, she wonders who or what was there with her that night, and why did it seem so familiar? 3. The Locked Room. Jake lived in an old house on the outskirts of Prague in the Czech Republic. The building, over 100 years old, was full of stories and quirks, but what always caught his eye was the bedroom at the end of the second-floor corridor. It was always locked, and the previous owner of the house had simply said that it was best to leave it that way. Jake never questioned it much. The room seemed forgotten, and he had more important things to worry about. That night, however, something changed. Jake was home alone, and a violent storm was raging in the city. The wind howled through the gaps in the windows, and thunder briefly lit up the dark corridors of the house. He was about to go to sleep when he heard a strange sound coming from the end of the corridor. It was a low noise, like scratching or something being moved inside the locked room. He froze for a moment. Maybe it's just the wind, he thought, trying to convince himself. But the sound continued, now accompanied by something that sounded like barely audible whispers. Jake's heart began to beat faster. He grabbed a flashlight and walked slowly to the bedroom door. As he got closer, he noticed that the sounds were getting louder. It was as if something was alive inside. He hesitated for a moment before turning the handle. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. That didn't make sense. He was sure he had never touched it before. Pushing the door open carefully, Jake revealed a room covered in dust and cobwebs. The air in there was heavy and smelled musty. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest with intricate carvings that seemed to depict scenes from ancient battles. The sounds seemed to come from there. Against every instinct that told him to run, Jake approached the chest. As he touched it, he felt a strange vibration run through his hands, as if something was pulsating inside it. He slowly opened the lid, revealing only darkness inside. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing Jake's flashlight and closing the door behind him with a deafening bang. In the total darkness, he heard something emerge from the chest. Heavy footsteps and deep breathing. Jake tried desperately to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He felt a presence behind him, something large and cold that seemed to absorb all the light and heat in the room. When he finally looked back, he saw red eyes glowing in the darkness. The creature spoke in a language Jake didn't understand, but its intention was clear. He had unleashed something that shouldn't exist in the world of the living. The next morning, the neighbors noticed that the windows of the house were all open and the main gate wide open. When they went in to check, they found the room at the end of the corridor empty, no sign of the chest or Jake. The story quickly spread around the region as yet another urban legend about the occult forces that inhabit Prague's old houses. Some say that on stormy nights it is still possible to hear whispers coming from that long locked room. Jake was never found again. 4. The disconnected telephone. Olivia lived alone in a cozy house on the outskirts of London. The house was small but perfect for her, a quiet place where she could work on her projects as a graphic designer. That night, an intense storm was raging in the city. Lightning lit up the sky, and the sound of heavy rain beating against the windows created an unsettling atmosphere. Olivia liked storms. She found them relaxing. Curled up in a blanket on the sofa, with a cup of tea beside her, she watched an old movie while the wind howled outside. Then the landline rang. That sound made her jump. Olivia rarely used the landline. In fact, it was there more at the insistence of her mother, who thought it was always good to have a plan B in case the cell phone failed. Who would call her at that time? Thinking it might be something important, Olivia got up and answered. "Hello?" she said, with a hesitant tone. For a moment, all she heard was static on the other end of the line. Then a cold, masculine voice spoke. "I see you!" Olivia's heart raced. She was paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to process what she had just heard. "Who are you? Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, trying to sound firm. The call ended abruptly. She stared at the phone in her hands, trying to understand what had happened. Maybe it was a prank, but something in the man's voice seemed too real, too threatening. Feeling uneasy, Olivia picked up her cell phone to call the police. Before she even dialed the number, something caught her eye. The landline cable was disconnected from the wall. How was that possible? The phone shouldn't work without being plugged in. A shiver ran down her spine as she looked around the room. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched began to grow. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, first slowly, then more intensely, until the whole house was plunged into complete darkness. Olivia felt her heart speed up even more as she tried to turn on the flashlight on her cell phone with trembling hands. The beam of light partially illuminated the room, but the shadows cast by the windows and furniture seemed to move strangely. She ran to the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. She checked each lock meticulously, but when she returned to the room, she noticed something disturbing. The landline was off the hook. Olivia felt as if she was losing her grip on reality. She knew she had put the phone back after answering the call. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen as a safety measure, she decided to hide in the cupboard under the stairs while she thought about what to do. Inside, the silence was almost deafening. All she could hear was her own panting and the rapid beating of her heart. She tried calling the police on her cell phone again, but the signal was weak because of the storm. As she waited anxiously for a connection, she heard footsteps coming from the corridor. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, each echoing through the house as if someone was exploring every corner of it. Olivia held her breath as the footsteps approached the cupboard where she was hiding. The doorknob creaked slightly. Someone was trying to open the door. She gripped the knife tightly and closed her eyes, expecting the worst. But then the footsteps stopped and everything fell silent again. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, Olivia plucked up the courage to come out of hiding. The house was plunged into total darkness, except for the dim light of the cell phone flashlight in her hand. She walked slowly into the living room and saw something that made her blood run cold. There were wet marks on the floor, human footprints leading from the front door to the hallway where the closet was. Without a second thought, Olivia grabbed her keys and ran out of the house towards the car parked in the garage. The cold rain soaked her clothes as she struggled to unlock the car door with trembling hands. When she finally managed to get into the car and start it, she looked through the rearview mirror and saw something terrifying. A figure standing at the living room window, watching her. She drove to the nearest police station and told the police everything. The officers went to investigate immediately, but found no signs of a break-in or any intruder inside the house. However, when they reviewed the security cameras installed in the street by the neighbors, they discovered something disturbing. A hooded man had stood on the sidewalk in front of Olivia's house for hours before disappearing into the darkness of the storm. His identity was never discovered. Olivia decided never to return to that house again and moved to an apartment in another city with heightened security and cameras installed in every possible corner. But even so, she was never able to forget that night, especially as she still received strange phone calls from unknown numbers saying only, "I see you." 5. The Broken Mirror. Ryan lived in a small town in the Scottish countryside, known for its bucolic landscapes and mystery stories. The house where he lived with his grandmother was old, full of furniture and objects that seemed to carry centuries of history. Among them was an imposing mirror with a dark wooden frame carved in intricate detail which stood in the main hallway. His grandmother always said that the mirror was cursed and constantly warned him not to touch it. "That mirror has seen things you can't imagine, Ryan. It's not like the others," she would say in a serious tone. Ryan, however, never paid much attention to the stories. To him, the mirror was just another old, useless object. One day, while helping his grandmother reorganize the house, Ryan accidentally bumped into the mirror while carrying a pile of heavy books. The impact was enough to knock it over. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the house like thunder. He looked at the shards scattered on the floor and felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. His grandmother rushed into the room when she heard the noise and turned pale at the sight of the broken mirror. "You shouldn't have done that," she exclaimed, visibly shaken. "Now something has been released." Ryan tried to reassure her that it was just superstition. Despite this, that night, he couldn't get his grandmother's words out of his head. After dinner, she went to bed early, leaving Ryan alone in the living room. He decided to watch a movie to distract his mind. As he watched, something caught his eye in the reflection of the switched-off television. For a brief moment, he swore he saw his own face looking back at him. But it wasn't moving as it should. Ryan stood up quickly and looked around. The house was silent, except for the occasional sound of the wind beating against the windows. He laughed nervously to himself, attributing it to his imagination and tiredness. However, as the night progressed, things began to get stranger. As he passed through the corridor to get a glass of water from the kitchen, he noticed something disturbing. In the small mirror hanging on the corridor wall, his reflection seemed to stand still even as he walked. He stopped abruptly and stared into the mirror. His reflection smiled at him, but Ryan wasn't smiling. Panic seized him. He ran to his grandmother's room to tell her what had happened, but found the room empty. The bed was made up, as if no one had slept there that night. Desperate, Ryan returned to the living room and tried to call the police using his cell phone, but there was no signal. It was then that he realized something even more terrifying. All the mirrors in the house seemed to be reflecting his image, but each reflection was doing something different. In the living room mirror, his reflection seemed to be crying. In the bathroom mirror, he was standing still with his eyes fixed on Ryan, as if he were watching him intently. And in the small mirror in the hallway, his reflection was holding something in his hands. It seemed to be a fragment of the broken mirror. Ryan began to hear whispers coming from all sides of the house. They weren't clear words, but indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the mirrors themselves. He tried to cover the larger ones with sheets and towels in an attempt to block out the disturbing reflections, but the whispers continued. Suddenly, all the lights in the house flickered before going out completely. In the total darkness, Ryan felt a presence behind him, something cold and heavy that seemed to suck in all the air around him. When he finally plucked up the courage to look towards the large broken mirror in the main hallway, now reduced to shards scattered across the floor, he saw something he would never forget. All the versions of himself were there reflected in the shards of broken glass, but none of them looked human. One of them reached out a hand through the cracked glass as if to pull him in. The next morning, when the neighbors noticed that the door to the house was open and went to check if everything was all right, they found only the shards of the mirror scattered on the floor of the main hallway. There was no sign of Ryan or his grandmother. The story quickly spread through the town as yet another local legend about cursed objects and forces beyond human comprehension. Some locals say it's still possible to hear whispers coming from that abandoned house, especially when someone passes by at night. And what about the mirror? They say its fragments still reflect something, but no one has the courage to look at it for long to find out what. 6. The visitor at the door. Sophia was alone in her house in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. It was a cold, silent night, and the wind whistled softly through the gaps in the windows. She was sitting on the sofa reading a book when she heard a knock on the front door. The sound echoed through the house, firm and insistent, interrupting the silence of the night. Confused, Sophia looked at the clock. It was past midnight. Who could be knocking at that hour? Cautiously, she got up and walked to the door. Looking through the peephole, she saw a man standing there. He was tall, wore a dark coat, and his face was partially covered by a hat that cast shadows over his eyes. He was motionless, like a statue. "Can I help you?" asked Sophia through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer. He didn't move or make any gesture to indicate that he had heard. The knocking stopped, but his presence there was disturbing. Feeling uncomfortable, Sophia decided to ignore him and return to the room, trying to convince herself that he would go away. However, a few minutes later, the knocks started again, but this time they were coming from inside the house. Sophia's heart raced. She froze in place for a moment before slowly turning to look around the room. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Picking up her cell phone with trembling hands, she tried to call the police. To her surprise and growing terror, the phone had no signal. The lights began to flicker, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. Sophia felt panic take hold of her as she tried to think. "This is impossible," she muttered to herself. The house was locked. No one could have entered. Determined to face whatever was happening, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started checking every room in the house. First, she went to the bedroom. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, to the bathroom. It was empty, but when she reached the corridor leading to the basement, she felt an inexplicable chill in the air. The knocks now seemed to be coming from there. Sophia hesitated to go down the dark stairs to the basement, but she knew she had to find out what was going on. With slow, careful steps, she descended the creaking stairs, lighting the way with her flashlight. The basement was cold and damp, with old boxes stacked in the corners and old furniture covered in dusty sheets. In the center of the basement was a wooden chair turned on its side. The flashlight flickered in her hand as she slowly approached. As she got closer, she noticed something engraved on the floor around the chair, strange marks that looked like symbols or letters in an unknown language. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was absolute now, but Sophia felt that she wasn't alone in that dark, claustrophobic space. Before she could react, she heard a low, guttural whisper from behind her. "You opened the door." She quickly turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was no one there, only shadows dancing on the stone walls of the basement. Running back upstairs, Sophia locked the basement door behind her and leaned against it as she tried to catch her breath. But when she looked forward again, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The man outside was now inside the house. He was standing in the hallway of the main entrance, exactly where she had stood minutes before looking through the peephole. His eyes shone with a pale, unnatural light as he stared at her without saying a word. Sophia tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. The figure began to move slowly towards her, each step echoing like thunder in the silent house. She ran to the bedroom and locked herself in, pushing furniture against the door to block the entrance. Grabbing her cell phone again, she desperately tried to call someone, anyone. But there was still no signal. Suddenly the knocking started again, now on the bedroom door. Sophia knew there was no way out. Trembling with fear, she looked out of the window for help or an escape route. Outside, there was only the darkness of night. No lights in the neighboring houses or cars passing by on the deserted street. The knocks grew louder and faster until they abruptly ceased once more. Silence once again dominated the room for a few moments before being broken by a low, drawn-out sound. Something was being written on the wall outside the room. Gathering up enough courage to look through the crack in the ajar door, Sophia saw words written in something dark and dripping. "I'm already here." The next morning, the neighbors noticed that all the lights in the house were on and decided to check if everything was all right with Sophia. Upon entering the silent, empty house, they found only strange marks etched into the walls and no clues as to where Sophia might be. Since then, local residents have avoided going near that house at night, especially because they say they hear banging coming from the walls when it's too quiet in the neighborhood. 7. The TV channel. Liam was at home, alone, on a quiet night. The living room was lit only by the light of the television, which was showing some movie that he was barely paying attention to. The background sound was comforting, filling the silence of the house. But then something strange happened. The TV changed channels on its own. At first, Liam thought it was a technical problem. He had heard of televisions changing channels on their own due to faults in the remote control or external interference. He picked up the remote and tried to go back to the previous channel, but the TV wouldn't respond. Instead, the screen remained static, displaying only that white hiss characteristic of off-air transmissions. He frowned and got up to check the set. Maybe it was just a temporary glitch. But as he approached the TV, he noticed something disturbing. There were whispered voices, mixed in with the sound of the static. He turned up the volume to hear better and managed to make out a few words, but they didn't make sense. They sounded like fragments of sentences in an unknown language. Uncomfortable, Liam tried to turn off the TV using the button on the set itself. To his amazement, it was still on, even after several attempts. The hissing got louder, and the voices began to sound clearer and more familiar. "Liam!" called a female voice between the whispers. He froze. His name had been pronounced clearly. He looked around the room, hoping to find some logical explanation. Perhaps someone had hacked into the TV system or was using some kind of remote device to play tricks on him. But there was no one there. "Liam!" repeated the voice, now more insistent. His heart raced. He slowly retreated to the sofa without taking his eyes off the screen. The voices began to multiply, as if several people were talking at once. Some sounded desperate, others were laughing sinisterly. Suddenly, the image on the TV changed. Amid the static, Liam saw something that looked like a distorted reflection of his own living room. In the center of the image was himself, sitting on the sofa, exactly as he was at that moment. "This isn't possible," he muttered to himself, his breathing quickening. On the screen, his reflection began to move. But Liam wasn't moving. The distorted version of him on the TV slowly turned its head to look directly at him through the screen and smiled disturbingly. Liam tried to unplug the TV from the wall socket, but it still remained on. The smile of the reflection on the screen disappeared, giving way to a serious and threatening expression. "You shouldn't have looked," said the voice on the TV. At that moment, the lights in the house began to flicker frantically before going out completely. The room was plunged into total darkness, except for the pale, flickering light of the static television. Liam felt a shiver run down his spine when he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, heavy footsteps that seemed to be coming from the corridor that led to the bedrooms. "Liam!" called the female voice again, now coming directly from the dark corridor. He turned quickly to look in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing but the oppressive darkness. When he turned his eyes back to the TV, he realized that his reflection had disappeared from the static screen. Panic seized him. He ran out of the house without looking back and went straight to the nearest neighbor's house in search of help. When he finally managed to get back with a local policeman to check what was going on, they found the television switched off and unplugged, just as Liam had tried to do before. Since that night, Liam has never been able to watch television on his own again. He sold the set the next day and spent weeks trying to forget what happened that strange and terrifying night. But to this day, he swears that he still hears whispers when he walks past electronic devices that are on, as if someone is still trying to call him by name through the invisible airwaves. And those were the 7 horror stories involving being home alone. So what did you think? Which of these stories gave you the creeps? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. If you enjoyed the video and want more content like this, don't forget to leave a like, because it really helps the channel grow and brings you more scary videos. Oh, and if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate the little bell. See you in the next video, if you dare.